The committee room was supposed to be just another routine hearing. Rows of suited staffers shuffled papers, cameras hovered like vultures, and senators leaned back in their leather chairs, pretending not to be waiting for the fireworks everyone knew were coming. And then Tim Scott struck. With a smug half-smile, the 61-year-old senator leaned into his microphone and delivered the kind of line designed not to spark debate, but to cut flesh. He called Jasmine Crockett inexperienced, reckless, and unqualified to sit at the table. He didn't just question her politics, he went after her identity, her right to even be there. The room shifted. A murmur ran through the audience. Staffers froze mid-note, reporters raised their heads, and every camera locked on the youngest face at the table, the 33-year-old Texas congresswoman who, in that moment, looked like the underdog standing across from a giant. But Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't fumble through her notes, didn't even blink twice. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and simply watched Scott as he spoke, like someone watching a storm they already knew would pass. That stillness was its own kind of power. While Scott's voice rose, growing sharper, Crockett's silence drew the oxygen out of the room. It was the silence of a fighter who had heard worse, faced tougher, and wasn't about to give her opponent the satisfaction of a reaction. And yet, in that silence, the tension doubled. Viewers at home felt it. People in the gallery felt it. Even Scott, as he finished his little speech, sensed something was off. He had delivered his jab, but instead of landing, it seemed to hang there, waiting to be crushed. Crockett glanced down at her papers, then looked up. A faint, almost amused smile flickered across her face. The senator had just made the mistake of his career, and she knew it. Because what she was about to say next would flip the room, flip the narrative, and flip the balance of power in a single breath. The senator thought he had the last word, the narrator intones. But what came next would leave him speechless. What had just happened wasn't a small exchange. It wasn't one senator teasing another. It was bigger, much bigger. In that room, Scott wasn't just attacking Jasmine Crockett. He was speaking to every young politician who'd ever been told they weren't ready. He was speaking to every woman who'd been told to sit down and let the men handle it. He was speaking to every person of color who'd had their qualifications questioned before their ideas were even heard. And that's why the air turned heavy after his words. Because everyone knew this was no longer just about policy. It was about power. Tim Scott had built his career on the persona of the seasoned veteran. He was the elder statesman, the polished Republican who knew the ropes, and tonight he was playing that role to the hilt. He leaned back, shoulders squared, wearing the kind of smile that said, "You're out of your depth, and I'm here to remind you." But the gamble he took, undermining Jasmine Crockett on live television, was one that came with massive risk. He wasn't facing just another freshman lawmaker. He was facing a former attorney with a courtroom reputation for shredding opponents with surgical precision. And worse for him, the cameras were rolling. Outside that chamber, millions of Americans were tuned in. Some out of boredom, some out of curiosity, and some because they lived for these gladiator moments when politics transformed into raw human drama. Every word was being clipped, memed, and live-tweeted in real time. And here's the thing about viral moments. You don't control them once they're out. One phrase, one glare, one clapback, and suddenly the internet decides who's the hero and who's the clown. Scott thought this was his show. He thought Crockett was just the supporting character, the young congresswoman who'd fumble under pressure and give him the soundbite he needed. But what he didn't realize was that the crowd, both inside the chamber and across America, was growing impatient with the same old script. People were tired of arrogance dressed as wisdom, tired of watching loud voices drown out steady ones. And that's what made this moment so dangerous for him. Because Crockett wasn't giving him outrage. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't stumbling. She was waiting for him to run out of rope. In the eyes of the cameras, that wait was deadly. Every second she stayed calm, Scott looked more rattled, more desperate, more like the bully who couldn't land the knockout punch. The stakes weren't just rising for Scott, they were shifting against him. What began as a one-sided attack was turning into a trap he had set for himself. The tension in the room was electric now. You could almost feel the audience leaning forward, waiting, whispering. It was as if the entire chamber, and maybe even the entire country, was holding its breath, waiting for Crockett's reply. And then she adjusted her microphone, a tiny gesture, nothing more. But it was enough to silence the whispers, enough to signal that the waiting was over. This wasn't just about winning an argument anymore, the narrator's voice cuts in. This was about who got to define what strength looked like in American politics, and Jasmine Crockett was about to show the world. To understand why this clash mattered, you have to understand Tim Scott. For years, he had branded himself as the polished Republican with a calm demeanor, the man who could charm donors at a luncheon and then spar with Democrats on the Senate floor without breaking a sweat. On paper, he was the safe choice, a seasoned politician who spoke in polished sound bites and rarely raised his voice. But that polish had a sharp edge. Beneath the smile was a man who'd learned the art of belittling opponents without ever saying the word outright. He'd mastered the smirk, the eyebrow raise, the subtle dismissal that made opponents look small and him look superior. It wasn't yelling. It wasn't fire. It was condescension dressed as confidence. And for a long time, it worked. Reporters called him measured. Colleagues called him experienced. Supporters called him a steady hand. But behind closed doors, many saw something else. A politician who thrived on reminding others that he had been in the game longer, that they hadn't earned the right to challenge him. That's why the way he came after Jasmine Crockett made sense. To him, she was everything he thought politics had gotten wrong. Young, unapologetic, and unafraid to speak with fire. She represented a generation that didn't wait its turn, and that irritated Scott more than anything. There was history here, too. Scott had made a career of taking jabs at younger lawmakers, especially women who dared to challenge his authority. In interviews, he'd laugh off their arguments as emotional. On the Senate floor, he'd casually remind them of how Washington really works. He believed his years in office gave him the upper hand, but arrogance has a funny way of aging badly. Because outside the marble walls of the Capitol, times were changing. Social media had leveled the playing field. Viral clips mattered more than seniority. A single sharp line could outweigh decades of experience. And while Scott was still playing politics like it was 1995, Jasmine Crockett understood the new rules. What made this even more ironic was Scott's own contradictions. He often presented himself as the voice of humility and unity, the senator who claimed to rise above partisan theatrics. Yet here he was, turning a hearing into a personal attack show. The same man who preached about dignity was trying to strip it away from a colleague live on camera. It wasn't the first time either. Scott had built a quiet record of moments where his mask slipped. A sarcastic jab at a fellow senator that backfired. A dismissive laugh during a debate that went viral for all the wrong reasons. A speech where he compared critics to rookies who didn't understand the game. Each time, he escaped real backlash because the news cycle moved fast. But this moment, this clash with Crockett, was different. Because this time his target wasn't just another opponent. She was someone who had no intention of being his political prop. Scott underestimated her, the same way he had underestimated others. But what he didn't realize was that Crockett thrived on underestimation. It was fuel. Every dismissive look, every cutting remark, every "you don't belong" here was oxygen to her fire, and the cameras caught it all. That's what made Scott's downfall inevitable. His attack wasn't just words. It was a replay of the same tired arrogance people had grown weary of. The optics were brutal. An older, powerful senator sneering at a younger black woman in public. It looked less like experience and more like entitlement. And Crockett knew it. She knew the longer he talked, the more rope he gave himself to hang with. She didn't have to interrupt him. She didn't even have to defend herself yet. All she had to do was wait. The irony was almost poetic. For a man who prided himself on control, Scott was about to lose control of the one thing he valued most, the narrative. He thought experience made him untouchable. The narrator intones. But experience is nothing if you can't read the room, and Tim Scott was about to learn that the hard way. To understand why Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch when Tim Scott came swinging, you have to know where she came from. Jasmine Crockett wasn't born into the polished world of politics. She wasn't groomed in Ivy League hallways or cushioned by family wealth. She grew up knowing what struggle looked like, what injustice felt like, and what it meant to fight for every inch of respect. Before Congresswoman Crockett was making headlines on Capitol Hill, she was an attorney standing in packed courtrooms in Texas, defending clients that the system was ready to throw away. She wasn't the kind of lawyer who wore $5,000 suits and played golf with judges. She was the kind who rolled up her sleeves, combed through case files until sunrise, and stood toe-to-toe with prosecutors twice her age. And she built a reputation. In Dallas, word spread fast. If you want someone who will fight for you like her life depends on it, you want Jasmine Crockett. Judges noticed, prosecutors noticed. And soon, so did the public. Because she wasn't just sharp with the law, she was fierce with her words. Every courtroom clash was a training ground. Every cross-examination taught her timing, restraint, and how to land the kind of verbal punches that left opponents scrambling for their notes. Those same skills would one day serve her well in Washington. But Crockett wasn't just a lawyer. She was an activist. She marched. She organized. She spoke at rallies where her microphone sometimes barely worked. But her voice still carried. She wasn't afraid of confrontation. She thrived in it. Because for her, confrontation wasn't about ego. It was about justice. So when people in Washington tried to dismiss her as too new, too loud, or too bold, she wore it like armor, because every barrier she faced only added another layer of resilience. There's something magnetic about leaders who rise from the ground up. They don't just talk policy. They carry lived experience. Crockett carried the voices of her community, her courtroom clients, and every woman who had been told she didn't belong in the rooms where decisions were made. That's why Tim Scott's attack didn't shake her. She'd heard worse. She'd been doubted before. She'd been underestimated her whole life, and each time she turned doubt into fuel. But this wasn't just about her personal grit. Crockett represented a new kind of politics, unapologetic, fearless, and unafraid to call things as they were. In a city full of career politicians who measured every word, Crockett spoke the way people actually spoke. That made her dangerous to her opponents and magnetic to her supporters. She was also strategic. Behind the firebrand reputation was a woman who prepared relentlessly. Crockett studied, memorized, anticipated. By the time she walked into a hearing, she already knew what was coming. That's why she could sit silently while Scott hurled his barbs. She didn't need to rush. She was waiting for her moment. And here's the twist. Every part of her journey, the late nights in court, the marches in the streets, the fights no one thought she could win, had trained her for this exact showdown. It was never about luck. It was about preparation. When Scott attacked her, he thought he was facing a rookie. In reality, he was facing someone who had spent her entire adult life sharpening her mind, her voice, and her composure. She wasn't intimidated by titles or seniority. She wasn't impressed by arrogance wrapped in a suit. She was ready, and that readiness was about to explode into the moment that would define her career. Because Crockett knew something Scott didn't. In debates, composure always beats noise. Truth always outlasts bluster. and one perfectly timed clapback can do more damage than 1,000 insults. The irony was rich. Scott thought Crockett was just another young lawmaker who hadn't earned her place. But Crockett wasn't just sitting in that chair because she won an election. She was sitting there because she had fought tooth and nail for years, in courtrooms and communities, proving herself again and again. Now, she was about to prove herself one more time, on the biggest stage yet. Her whole life had led to this moment, the narrator's voice cuts in, and with the nation watching, Jasmine Crockett was about to remind everyone why underdogs should never be underestimated. The room was already tense, but the real escalation hadn't even started. Yet, after his opening jab, Tim Scott doubled down. He leaned forward this time, his voice rising just enough to carry over the murmurs in the chamber. "With all due respect," he said, a phrase every politician knows means the opposite. Experience matters. Leadership matters. And, frankly, Congresswoman, slogans and passion aren't a substitute for wisdom. Gasps. A few smirks. Scott's allies chuckled under their breath as if the fight was already won. But Jasmine Crockett didn't bite. She adjusted her pen, made a note, and kept her face unreadable. That silence. It rattled him. So he pressed harder. He began interrupting. Each time Crockett opened her mouth, Scott would jump back in, waving his hand, his voice cutting across. Hers. He thought if he kept her off balance long enough, she'd stumble. He thought volume and repetition would win the moment. It didn't. Because every time he interrupted, Crockett didn't speed up. She slowed down. She sat taller, her eyes sharper, her tone calmer. And that contrast was devastating. On one side, a 61-year-old senator visibly agitated, voice raised, papers shuffling, sweat collecting at his brow. On the other, a 33-year-old congresswoman, calm, steady, waiting. The audience noticed. Cameras noticed. The internet definitely noticed. Live tweets were already flooding timelines. Why does he sound so rattled while she looks unbothered? Crockett is letting him bury himself. She's about to end this man's whole career. The energy in the room flipped. What began as Scott's show was turning into Crockett's stage. At one point, Scott slammed his notes down and declared, "This isn't a courtroom, this is the United States Senate." The irony was almost comedic, because in that instant, it felt exactly like a courtroom. And Crockett? She was the attorney letting her opponent rant before dismantling him piece by piece. Each interruption only made the audience lean closer. Reporters scribbled faster. Staffers exchanged nervous glances. Everyone sensed it. The build-up, the storm gathering in Crockett's silence. And then came the moment. Scott finished a particularly long-winded monologue, full of sweeping gestures and tired cliches. He leaned back, triumphant, expecting Crockett to stammer through a rebuttal. Instead, she simply reached for her microphone. The metallic click echoed louder than his entire speech. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on Scott. For the first time all night, she smiled. Not a broad grin, but the kind of sharp smile that told everyone in the room, "It's over." The chamber went silent. Even Scott seemed caught off guard, because everyone knew the waiting was over. The underdog was about to strike. The senator thought he could control the stage by shouting her down, the narrator intones. But in politics, as in life, the loudest voice isn't always the strongest, and Jasmine Crockett was about to prove it. The microphone clicked on, and for the first time that night the room belonged to Jasmine Crockett. She didn't rush. She didn't fire back with the same raised voice Scott had used. Instead, she let a half-second of silence stretch across the chamber. Silence so thick you could hear the scribbles of reporters' pens. Silence that made every camera zoom in, waiting. And then, calmly, deliberately, she began. "Senator," Crockett said, her voice smooth but razor-edged, "I respect your years in this chamber. But respect is not the same thing as fear, and I will not be intimidated by seniority when truth is on my side. The words hit like a gavel. Scott shifted in his chair, suddenly less comfortable. Crockett didn't look at her notes. She didn't need them. She had come prepared. She began with the facts. Precise, surgical. She recited Scott's own record back to him. Votes he'd taken, statements he'd made, moments that contradicted the very accusations he had just leveled at her. Each line landed like a carefully aimed punch. "You say experience matters," she said, eyes never leaving his. "Yet your experience includes voting against measures that would have protected the very communities you now lecture me about." A murmur ran through the chamber. Staffers looked at each other. Cameras flashed. Scott raised his hand, trying to interrupt, but Crockett didn't pause. Her courtroom training kicked in. Once she had the floor, she owned it. Now she shifted gears, from facts to moral clarity. "You've mistaken passion for recklessness," she continued. "But what you call passion, I call purpose. What you call inexperience, I call perspective. The perspective of millions of Americans who are tired of hearing the same old voices telling them to wait their turn." That line hit like thunder. Even some on Scott's side stopped nodding and sat back, stunned. And then came the dagger, the personal flip. She leaned forward slightly, voice steady, tone sharpened. "Senator, you say this isn't a courtroom, but maybe that's the problem. In court, evidence matters. Preparation matters. Accountability matters. Here, it seems the loudest voice thinks it wins by default. But tonight, volume won't save you." The chamber went still. Scott's face flushed. His jaw tightened. He shuffled his papers, trying to regain composure, but it was too late. The cameras caught everything. The sweat at his temple, the tightening grip on his pen. Crockett wasn't finished. She slowed her pace even more, letting each word hang heavy. "Experience is only valuable if you learn from it. And what I'm learning tonight is that arrogance grows louder when the argument grows weaker." Boom. It was the kind of line that doesn't just answer an attack, it buries it. The kind of line destined to become a tweet, a headline, a TikTok soundbite, and the reaction proved it. Gasps echoed. Some in the audience stifled laughs. A few even clapped before being hushed. The chamber had turned. Scott tried to interject again, but his voice cracked with urgency. Crockett simply raised a hand, not rudely, but firmly, and kept going. Now she was in full control. "You wanted to make this about my age, my passion, my so-called inexperience," she said. "But I'll tell you what this really is. It's about the future versus the past. It's about who gets to have a voice in this country. And if you think belittling me will silence the people I represent, then you've already lost." That was the knockout. Scott slumped back. For once, the senator who always had a comeback had nothing left to say. His allies avoided eye contact. His staff looked down at their notes. The cameras, though, they loved it. They lingered on Scott's silence, then cut back to Crockett's. Composure, her faint smile, her unshaken presence. Narrator's voice. With a few sentences, the tables turned. The attack meant to humiliate her had become the moment that defined her strength. And, for the first time all night, Tim Scott had no words. The clapback was complete. But the moment didn't end in that chamber. Within minutes, clips were already flooding social media. Hashtags were forming. Commentators were reacting. The world outside was about to amplify what the room had just witnessed. And as Crockett leaned back in her chair, adjusting her notes with the same calm she started with, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a win. This was history. The senator who thought he held all the power had just been silenced. The narrator closes the section. And Jasmine Crockett had delivered the mic drop of the year. The moment Jasmine Crockett leaned back in her chair, the battle inside the chamber was over. But outside those walls, the real war, The war of perception, of headlines, and of digital echo was just beginning. It started small. A junior reporter live tweeting the hearing wrote, "Crockett just shut Scott down with the line of the night. Arrogance grows louder when the argument grows weaker." Within just 2 minutes, that tweet had 10,000 likes. By the time the hearing wrapped, it was trending nationwide. Then came the clip. C-SPAN's feed captured the exact exchange. Tim Scott's smug grin fading into silence, Crockett's calm stare holding the room. That 30-second clip spread like wildfire. On Twitter, it carried the caption, "Tim Scott thought he was schooling Crockett. Instead, she taught him a masterclass in composure." On TikTok, users remixed her voice over rap beats, transforming it into a diss track that racked up millions of views overnight. Instagram Reels followed, each stamped with dramatic subtitles. "Volume won't save you." Every platform found its moment. Soon, the memes rolled in. Scott holding up blank papers with the caption, "When you bring notes, but she brings facts." Another of Crockett calmly sipping water, titled, "Stay. Hydrated while you bury a senator." A split-screen image spread rapidly. Scott red-faced, Crockett unbothered, captioned simply, "Experience versus evidence." Late-night comedians picked up the energy. One joked, "Tim Scott went in with a microphone and left with a mute button," sending audiences into roaring laughter. By morning, the news cycle had seized the moment. CNN described it as the moment the balance of power shifted. MSNBC labeled it Crockett's clapback heard across America. Even Fox News, though critical, admitted Scott was caught off guard. Major newspapers echoed the sentiment. The Washington Post ran with the headline, "Jasmine Crockett redefines what it means to stand your ground." The New York Times observed, "In a chamber of shouting, composure wins." Politico summed it up bluntly, "The attack that backfired and the clapback that made a star." But beyond pundits and media, the people themselves spoke louder. In Houston, Crockett's district office rang non-stop, calls from supporters, voters, and even strangers thanking her for saying what we've all been wanting to say. On college campuses, students replayed the clip in group chats, dubbing it our generation's mic drop moment. One viral TikTok comment captured the public mood perfectly. "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the bar." That single comment alone drew 500,000 likes. Meanwhile, Tim Scott's silence grew deafening. Reporters camped outside his office demanding a response, but the senator offered none. His normally active social media accounts went dark for 2 full days. And in politics, silence speaks louder than words. Hashtags like #Scott, speechless, and @Crockett Clapback surged across platforms. By the weekend, Crockett's name had been searched more times than any other member of Congress. The viral surge became more than just entertainment. It was a rallying point. Progressives framed Crockett as proof that fresh voices could stand up to entrenched power. Moderates praised her calm demeanor as the style politics needs. Even some conservatives admitted privately that Scott walked into a trap. But the most profound impact came from ordinary Americans who saw their own struggles mirrored in her words. A single mom from Detroit wrote, "When she said volume won't save you, I felt that. That's every boss I've ever had who thought yelling made them right." Thousands agreed. By week's end, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman. She was a symbol. Her clip appeared on billboards, became a trending audio track, and even slipped into classroom discussions about public speaking. Journalists compared it to historic political showdowns. Analysts debated whether this single moment had elevated her from rising figure to national force. The proof came quickly. Campaign donations surged 400% in just 3 days, powered by grassroots donors who had never even heard her name before the clash, but who now wanted her voice louder than ever. The attack was supposed to shrink her. Instead, it expanded her reach beyond the chamber, beyond her district, and into the bloodstream of American politics. Tim Scott walked in with a target. Jasmine Crockett walked out with a movement.